Thank you. Welcome to my poster. A little bit about me. My background is neuroscience and computer science and cognitive psychology. So I did an MD PhD and I did neurophysiology for my PhD. And the idea is to study as much about the brain as possible and find a model that captures the most phenomena with the least amount of parameters. Predominant recognition models of the brain are either Bayesian or neural networks. And the Bayesian networks are actually the most brain-like because they can do brain-like logic. You can prime or set preferences through priors. You can have expectations through likelihoods of what, for example, you expect in a cat. And then you can make logic interactions based on that. But the problem is this model is not connectionist. You must calculate distributions, and it's not very scalable. So you can't really build this model with theoretical neurons, and you can't make huge models of this. The other major type of networks are neural networks in the form where you take the input by the weights and you get the recognition. And the weights are thought to be dendrites, and the neuron picks up the information and pulls it through. Now, this model is much more scalable, but it has problems. There's no brain-like priming or expectation, and it is only semi-connectionist. You can model recognition through these neurons, but you can't really model the rehearsal that's needed for this model through neurons, because it requires storing all examples, shuffling them, and presenting them one at a time. And I call this problem a gambling problem, and it's very subtle, and most scientists don't really pay attention to it. So it ends up being a lot of hand-waving in order to apply these models, and that then hurts the field as well. So in a lifelike encounter timeline, you might see something, let's say a bicycle, and you learn it, a car, and you learn it, another type of bicycle, and you learn it, and you just kind of learn things as they come, one at a time. You don't have to stop and like rehearse and go, hey, what did I learn before? This sort of timeline is a lifelike encounter timeline, and it's unsorted. But if you want to use this type of neural network algorithm, implicitly, the model requires careful rehearsing and shuffling of all the data. So a corresponding neural network timeline would be, okay, if you see the first one, that's fine, you can learn it. But if you see a second one, well, what you have to do is remember the first and the second patterns and then pull them out and shuffle them for the algorithm and present them in a random way. And then repeat it and reshuffle until the network learns. And then what happens in the next time you have a new pattern, well, guess what? You have to redo the whole process again with all the old and the new data. So that means reshuffling, presenting, dealing, reshuffling, presenting, dealing, and reshuffling. And then when you have a new pattern, you have to do that again. A new pattern, you'd have to do that again. So you'd have to store all the patterns, and then also you must carefully prepare and balance them and shuffle them. And this needs to be done in neurons if it's going to be a neuroscience model. I mean, it's fine for computer science, but it's not fine as a neuroscientist if this is your model of the brain, because if this is going to be a connectionist model, it should be implemented in neurons, and so all the process of storing everything, balancing the data, shuffling, needs to be implemented with neurons. Otherwise, it's hand-waving. Moreover, neither of these type of models display a network-wide bursting. That is, in neurons, when you present a new pattern, you will see a burst of all the neurons, and then they will slowly come back down. Now, you could build with accumulator or integrate and fire models a model that shows this bursting. But the parameter is not the same that you would use for recognition, and the phenomena is not inherent in the recognition models. Right? You don't get this phenomena by having a recognition model. So I present a new model which is based on presynaptic regulatory feedback, where the weights are like the likelihoods. Priors can be implemented by the baseline activations of the neurons. And it's connectionist both during recognition and learning because it doesn't need this rehearsal. All the weights are feed-forward and feedback, and the feedback is regulatory and homeostatic in real time. And this model iterates back and forth during recognition, and the iterations estimate the distributions while recognizing. And so it becomes more like a Bayesian model, but it's not a Bayesian model because it doesn't have those distributions to calculate. It inherently shows network-wide bursting phenomena, and you see this through this network-wide optimization during recognition. Now that's a technical term, I'm not really going to go into that here. But I will walk you through how this model works. So each input neuron is balanced by inhibition. If an input projects to two outputs, well, those outputs then must project to the mechanism that balances and then feedback back to that same input. And that's true for every input within the network. So if an input goes to four outputs, well, those four outputs have to come back and inhibit. This way, the network is in constant communication of how well information is being used. And you can just add more and more representations in neurons this way, as long as they follow this rule. And I will also redraw this in a little bit of a simpler way as feed-forward feedback connections for every neuron. So how does this work? What I'm going to do is I'm going to show the simplest network possible, and I'm going to compare between the traditional feed-forward neural network and this model. Both can have their weights be written in a matrix where the output neurons are here and the inputs are here, and then you just write the weights. So if they both have the same type matrices, both have the same type of inputs and outputs, and both can draw the same nodes. Let's compare between the two. For learning, let's say I want neuron YA to be active only when X1 is active. And this is like a likelihood. Neuron YB be active when both inputs X1 and X2 are active. Now, in this new model, this is the expectation and the likelihood. So you basically can just put that in there. And this is part of the logic. You know, what are you expecting for each input? And that becomes the weights. So learning is much simpler here. Now, if you did this in feed-forward weights, you'd have to find the feed-forward weights that give this output. So you would do the rehearsal, the learning, and go through the gambling until you find the answer. And so then you get the weights. And so now we have the feed-forward weights and the regulatory feedback weights. And let's start with the feed-forward. We'll draw the nodes. You draw the feed-forward weights connected to each one. And then you can present the input of 1, 1, and just to verify that it works. And I'm also going to show the timeline of the activation to show the bursting. So on the right here is the timeline. And I'm also going to draw activation. Yellow will be active, black will be inactive, because I don't want to write a lot of numbers here. And so I'm going to put this 1, 1 as a stimulation to the network and see what the response is. And so in the feed forward, the basic equation is y equals wx. You multiply it through and you get the right answer. When x11 is active, you get 0, 1 for the output. And the dynamics look like this. There is no dynamics, basically. You just multiply it through. And the same if you put 1, 0. So now let's do the same thing with this new model. There is the intermediate with the inhibition, and this represents a sort of error, but an error during recognition. And let's draw the feed-forward feedback weights. It's 1, 0, so if weights go up, the feedback weights have to come back the same. And for YB, there's 2 coming in, so 2 coming down. I'm not going to draw anything with weights as 0, just so the thing will look clear. And now this iterates back and forth during recognition. And this is a confusing point for people. This is during recognition, and it's not to learn. This is just purely how this model recognizes. That's all I'm demonstrating here, just like I demonstrated in the feed-forward network. So when I do this, I get this sort of timeline, and let me walk you through. So I'm going to put in 1, 1 as the input. It's going to remain constant, right? It's the stimulation. And so that goes into the network. At first, because it's different than the state in the network, it causes a lot of error, which then projects initially to both outputs, which then causes a bursting. Then information comes back down in feedback, and you see that the feedback for x1 gets twice as much inhibition as x2. So that then dials down the input of x1 relative to x2, and then information feeds forward, and that starts separating out the activations of both neurons. Then information feeds back, and then forth again, and separates further, and continues forward, backwards, separate, until the network recognizes and gets the same answer. So this is how this network works. I'm going to show a bunch of demonstrations with it. I'm going to use the iris data set here because it's simple. It's got 4 inputs and 3 outputs in this example. So I'm going to show this more flexible update that you can't do with feed-forward networks. So I'm going to train only on data from 2 flowers, test the accuracy on it. And then I'm going to designate a new node for flower 3. I'm going to train only on the data from flower 3. And then I will test the full network with all the 3 flowers, and I get no difference on the performance. It doesn't matter the order of how things are presented or if they're shuffled. I can present all of one flower at once and all of the other flower at another time. It does not matter. And this is one of the things that the brain can do that the current algorithms can't do very well. Next, I'll show some of this network-wide bursting. And in this example, I trained it on the MNIST. It's the digits of the post office. I present a digit of 1 to the network, and you see you get this bursting and then coming back down. And the node that is recognized remains up, but all the rest come back down. And so you get this network-wide bursting. And I've done this with many other data sets as well. So to be brief, there isn't a lot of time here. The models are feed-forward feedback, neural network, or Bayesian. The neural network is connectionist, but not during learning. Priors, this one allows priors, and Bayesian allows priors, but the feed-forward neural network is a black box, and you don't really know what they are. The weights are likelihoods, which is just like Bayesian, but you don't have to learn the distributions. So that allows more logic to understand, oh, hey, a cat I expect, whiskers, feet, and so on. In Bayesian, you have to calculate the distributions, which is the downfall of the Bayesian network as a model of neuroscience, because it's not connectionist. And in neural net, the downfall is that the distributions are set during training, and that's why the order matters so much when you train. And so that all gets incorporated into these feed-forward weights. And so then updating becomes hassle when you want to change anything. And in this one, since the distributions are estimated during recognition, you can just change the network. And then as soon as you do another recognition, well, you're doing a new estimation with new information, and you can change all the distribution. So that's what gives it the flexibility. And so this model allows you to be more flexible, just add things as they go. Bayesian allows you some, but you also have to calculate the distributions. And then this gives you network-wide bursting, while all the others don't. Now there's also much more phenomena and so on, but again, this talk is very short. This is a poster, so it's really hard to present everything at once. I hope this generates some interest, and I hope the field can progress more, because I think all this hand waving is holding back the field in a huge way, because these models then generate experiments, and the experiments are designed based on a faulty ideology. And then that just feeds on to itself. Well, thank you for listening. I hope we can move neuroscience forward more with new ideas.